Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at the Arab world's overlooked civil war in Yemen, a proxy war. We were talking about it just before the break as well, with Yemeni journalist Afran Nasser, who joins us from Gothenburg in Sweden, Ali Mohammed al-Sharai, a Houthi activist in Sana'a, and former U.S. diplomat William Jordan. Welcome back to all three of you. Afran Nasser, how active, I'll put the same question I put before the break to Ali Mohammed, how active is the support of Iran and Hezbollah to the Houthis?
Well, I want to make 2 points, but first, in response to your question, I think there are many reports showing like clear evidence of a diplomatic and military support to the Houthis, whether through like a direct shipment of weapons to the Houthis inside Yemen, or even through indirect mediator. So the Omanis, for example, there are many reports showing that they are involved, even though they show that they are neutral to the war in Yemen, but there are a lot of reports showing that there had been a lot of channels in smuggling weapons to Yemen in support of the Houthis. But I think what your other guest, the American guest, mentioned earlier about how vital it is that Yemen's coastal port to the worldwide shipment industry. I think even though like all indicators show that we are going towards an escalation of the war in Yemen, I think it's very, very important that Western countries have some kind of wisdom and work really hard to de-escalate the situation in Yemen, because for the benefit or because the port in Yemen really represent a vital business road to the whole worldwide global business. I think Yemenis as well think that peace in Yemen represent or is a very vital safety for the global security overall. So what Yemenis right now really need that to work really hard in pushing peace efforts, because more than half of the population are sliding into famine, and the humanitarian situation on the ground is really beyond my even English description. Maybe if I would have spoken in Arabic, I would give you even more further description. But the humanitarian situation on the ground, people really are suffocating. There are a continuous of war crimes committed by different warring in the current conflict, and people really can't afford to go on into another involvement or a direct involvement from the U.S. In the current government, in the current conflict. So I think peace in Yemen really represent, or it is of a great concern to the whole global security.
All right, yes, and we can add to that a cholera epidemic which has broken out in Yemen. The naval attack that we talked about in part one, they followed the weekend aerial bombing of the funeral wake for the father of a senior cabinet member. The victims include some of those expected to negotiate a peace.
This is a crime against humanity. This was a funeral for one man in Sana'a, and now it has turned into a funeral for dozens of people. Hundreds were killed. This is just one crime among many Saudi crimes against Yemenis. Saudis kill Yemenis even though we've committed no sin. Just look at what they've done.
All right, that was the feeling immediately in the aftermath of the attack. Before the latest attacks on U.S. warships, the State Department and senior members of Congress were reacting. They were distancing themselves from the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen.
In light of the attack over the weekend, with the scrutiny that attack legitimately calls for, we are going to undertake additional reviews of aid and assistance that goes to Saudi Arabia.
I'm getting a tissue from William Jordan. William, we just heard there the State Department spokesperson talking about a review of the relationship with Saudi Arabia. The U.S., which refuels the jet planes for that air bombing campaign, which has provided logistics, which, according to Human Rights Watch, made the bombs that fell on that funeral wake. Is it time for the U.S. to pull the plug on all that?
Well, the U.S. has been re-examining and trying to figure out exactly how to, as some people will put it, recalibrate its support to exactly this operation, this coalition operation run by the Saudis, or headed up by the Saudis. This has been bubbling along for a while. I mean, I would say that, in fact, over the past year, and I've talked about this, I think, in previous debates, there has been a lot of unease in Washington about the Saudi-preferred narrative of this being sort of a Shia-Sunni
and yet the U.S. has gone along with it. Is it in part because it's a way to appease because they'd signed the deal with Iran on the Iran nuclear deal, and they say, all right, well, we have to, after all...
It's partly that, but it's also because I think, and you know, if our Saudi friend were here, he would, I'm sure we would be discussing this much more vigorously. I mean, it's also that Washington understands that Saudi Arabia feels strongly enough about what it believes Iran is doing through, you know, various proxies, including Hezbollah. Again, I don't entirely agree with all of this, but I think that over the past few months, it's very clear that this, whatever alliance of convenience has solidified into something more than it was, say, a year ago. And that Washington, trying to be loyal to its ally, and bearing in mind the Saudi irritation with Washington over the deal, with the nuclear deal with Iran, has probably been a bit indulgent. But let's not also forget the other big reason why Washington is in sort of a position of having to support the Saudis to a great degree, and that is absolutely these weapons are coming from the United States. The Saudis are a huge customer. There's you know, the last deal was something on the order of $115 billion. People writing in the press in Washington to say that the administration needs to do more to support Saudi Arabia's efforts, despite the controversy, point to the fact that, you know, somewhere around 160,000 Americans are employed in the industries that are producing the weapons that are going to Saudi Arabia. That doesn't mean, however, that there isn't controversy, because the images that are appearing on television, the reports by human rights observers, the terrible scale of almost seemingly indiscriminate violence and devastation that's being visited on the Yemeni people, as well as the political climate in Washington, which has turned decidedly anti-Saudi. Let's not forget the bill that you know, was over or that was passed over President Obama's veto to allow American victims of the 9/11 attacks to sue Saudi Arabia. There is in Washington a growing backlash against Saudi Arabia that, in my view, has been long overdue, but is finally gaining some traction and is forcing, I think, the administration to be more public in questioning what the Saudis are doing.
William, 24 hours ago, the panelists in the France 24 debate were saying that there's a lame duck session feeling to the Syria situation. Is there going to be a holding pattern when it comes to Yemen? It'll be the next president who decides whether or not to really cut the cord with Saudi Arabia on this air bombing campaign.
I think so, but there was a great deal of anguish by senators in particular right before the break for the elections that the administration which had delivered a notification of the latest arms deal, had done so during a time when the Congress was in recess. And so when the Senate resumed session, it really couldn't take up the matter in time to be able to block, question, or delay. I think that this is very possibly going to come up if there is as much time as there could be for substantive discussion of sort of pending issues. But you're right. I think that by and large, a lot of this will get kicked over. It will depend a lot on how much this the Saudi coalition operations continue, and whether, you know, we see more of the kind of tragedy that we saw recently with the attack on this funeral home. All
right, we're pleased to welcome Fahad Nazer, of risk consultants JTG, a former political advisor at the Saudi embassy in Washington. Thanks for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Is it time?
Always a pleasure, François. Thanks.
Is it time to stop the bombing campaign after the bombing of that funeral wake?
I think the Saudi government would like nothing more than to see this conflict come to an end. I think that the Saudis are well aware that the campaign and the conflict itself, the violence, has taken a toll on the people of Yemen, on the infrastructure, on the Yemeni economy, but it has also taken a toll on Saudi Arabia itself. And I think this fact gets lost a little bit in the discussion. So there's been a few hundred military personnel who have died in the conflict, and a few hundred civilians, Saudi civilians inside Saudi Arabia, who have also died. I mean, like I said, I think that there's a dismissal sometimes of the campaign.
All right, but now that we've seen what happened over the weekend, is this like the one incident too many, and enough is enough? Time to stop the bombing campaign and get to the bargaining table?
Well, I think this is really not up to, it is not Saudi Arabia's decision. I think that what you see, and I think the world here got a piece of a better idea of where the Houthis are coming from, who now have escalated and threatened to broaden the conflict by attacking the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea. I mean, the Houthis have a long history. And then again, if there's one point that I would like to emphasize here, is that this conflict began and predates the Saudi Arabia's involvement. It was well on, the violence had began and was continuing a year before Saudi Arabia got involved. This was, and to a large extent remains to be, a conflict between the Yemeni factions. You have the Houthis and their allies, and the forces loyal to the government of President Hadi. This is how the conflict began, and ultimately it is these parties that have to make a decision on whether they want to sit down and to bring the conflict to an end. Unfortunately, I think the Houthis and their allies have shown their reluctance, and now they've threatened to escalate the violence and the conflict further by attacking, the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea.
Ali Mohammed Al-Sharai, let me ask you, because we had earlier in the week as a guest former UN diplomat Lakhdar Brahimi. His take on this was that if we want to have a breakthrough, don't look to the outside world. It's got to first come from the people of Yemen themselves. Real ceasefire talks, real peace talks have to come from the Yemenites themselves. Do you agree?
Pardon me, could you please repeat what you said? Could you please repeat what you said?
What I'm saying is that for there to be peace in Yemen, does it first depend on the people of Yemen?
Yes, situation in Yemen is just a Yemeni affair, but we know that Saudi Arabia is interfering in the Yemeni affairs for more than 40 years. It's not just this time. As your guest there in Washington said that the war in Yemen happened 1 year before the Saudi Arabia interfered there. The Saudi Arabia interfered in the Yemeni situation and in the Yemeni affairs for more than 40 years, and they are attacking everybody here in Yemen. They are killing civilians, they are destroying everything. They attacked, as you have just reported and said, that they attacked all, can we say, institutions. They attacked hospitals, schools, funerals, weddings, festivals, and everything. And ceasefire and Yemenis went to the dialogue there in Geneva and Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia did not even stop the blockade and the siege, which is killing more than 25 million Yemeni. They are killing people with this siege and with this blockade. They are economically destroying Yemen. They are destroying the Yemeni infrastructure with every possible
let me ask Afra Nasser on
weapon
this.
They have.
Let me ask Afra Nasser. Who's got to make the first step?
No. Can I comment about the debate between that?
Sure.
The war started before the Saudis intervened, and the Saudis intervened because the Houthis waged their war against Yemenis, and this kind of debate. I think the Saudis have to realize that what they're doing right now has really an immense counter influence. So if the main purpose of the Saudi-led coalition intervention was really to restore legitimacy and to really minimize the influence of the Houthis, right now we're seeing like a counter influence effect on the ground. So with every one strike that bomb a bridge or bomb civilians, hospitals, schools, there is an expanded an expansion of Houthi affiliation on the ground. So with all the collateral damage happening right now in Yemen, and with all the criticism that the Saudis and the US is getting for the mounting war crimes, and there are multi-evidence, just the recent attack on the funeral hall, where like more than 100 people just died while the coalition knew that it was a civilian target, and the weapons that was used in that attacks. There are pictures taken from people on the ground saying on the remnants of the bombs that it was US-made weapon. So whatever the intention was for this intervention to happen in the first place is really doing the opposite impact of what they planned in the first place. But I think the main problem right now in the kind of road that we're going in Yemen war is that this cross point between how the war in Yemen is a very lucrative business for big economy Western countries like the US and UK, as Saudi Arabia is their main client, and also the other point where the Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh have a long history of fighting, and we're dealing with militias, people who really lived in caves and mountains, who really know nothing in their life other than to hold our weapon and just fight. So they are really willing to continue fighting to the last, drop of their blood. And in the same time, there is an international indifference, or there is no international will to really work harder in pushing peace efforts on Yemen, because the Yemen war is really making a lot of profit for big economies like the US and UK.
Picking up there on the point that William Jordan made earlier about the arms industry, the Financial Times in an editorial calls for Britain and France, both major suppliers of weapons to Riyadh, to stand alongside the US and press for a ceasefire and the deployment of UN-mandated peacekeepers. Earlier this week, French radio France Inter asked the Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault about the fact that France is a weapons supplier to Saudi Arabia.
When France's ally Saudi Arabia causes a bloodbath in Yemen, which happened again last Saturday with an attack on Shiite civilians that killed 140 and wounded hundreds, we don't hear you speak up very much.
I haven't stopped denouncing the bombing of civilians anywhere, and that's also true for Yemen. This is the French stance.
Yes, except Saudi Arabia is our ally, we sell them weapons, and these weapons might be used in Yemen.
The current situation is not at all acceptable to us. The military solution is not a solution.
William Jordan, is it a turning point?
I don't know if it's a turning point, because picking up on what was said from Gothenburg, I mean, the reality continues to be that the dynamics of the conflict in Yemen are largely being determined on the ground among these various militias that are playing it out, and the forces loyal to the government and the coalition.
But is it becoming untenable for the United States because the U.S. may have it harder to have the moral high ground in Syria when they denounce the carpet bombing of somewhere like Aleppo, when this kind of incident is happening?
Frankly, I think the U.S.
on their watch in Yemen.
Yeah, I think the U.S. is going to have a bigger problem dealing with the double standard, or how things are going to look when the battle to retake Mosul in Iraq begins, versus what's happening in Aleppo. given the similarities in those situations. There's no question that the U.S. is facing a certain amount of blowback, along with the Saudis, over how the Saudis have added, sort of a magnitude of destruction to what's going on in Yemen. But in terms of the underlying dynamic of the conflict and the inability of the UN mediation effort to bring the parties together, it goes back to the determination, as was just stated, of people like former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, various people, various militia leaders in the Houthis, among the Houthis, forces and groups that are loyal to the legal government. As well as the whole host of other jihadists and other people well armed in Yemen who are refusing to put down their arms at least long enough to have some kind of a ceasefire to give the UN brokered mediation effort, which is ultimately going to be what has to bring about some kind of an end to this conflict, a chance to move forward.
Fahad Nazer, you agree just not enough pressure is being brought about to put down weapons?
Perhaps, but I think that the point that I want to make here towards the end of this debate, and I'm sorry I missed most of it, but I think it's worth noting that both the UK and the United States have provided logistical and intelligence support to Saudi Arabia. Both of them, I mean, I've seen officials from both countries, neither of which thinks that Saudi Arabia, as a matter of policy, is deliberately targeting civilians. I think there's simply no evidence to support that contention. And again, I think we must here draw a sharp distinction between what we have
but
with this campaign.
Whether or not it's
unfortunately,
working, does it matter?
There is, it does matter, I think. I think we do have to keep in mind, unfortunately, we do have a contemporary example of what it looks like, of the level and scope of devastation when you do have a regime that deliberately targets and attacks civilian targets, and that's what you have in Syria. So that is simply not the case in Saudi Arabia. And again, this is coming from both U.S. and UK officials. I mean, there is concern about civilian casualties, and I'm sure there is concern in Saudi Arabia as well. Like I said earlier, I think the Saudis would like nothing more than to have this conflict come to an end, for the violence to come to an end, because frankly, they have their own internal domestic issues to concern themselves with.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we're running out of time. Yeah. But I want to thank you, Fahad Nazer. I want to thank Ali Mohammed Al-Sharai, Afra Nasser. So much more to talk about. William Jordan. Stay with us, though. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, François. So just to look at the Russian perspective on all of this, coming from Russian news websites and media generally. First of all, vis-a-vis what's happening in Yemen, they're very quick to compare and contrast what's happening in Yemen with what's happening in Syria. And you can see here in this headline on the Russia Today website, it's different. The US justifies Saudi self-defense, in inverted commas, in Yemen, and slams Russia's actions in Syria. So they're quite anxious to, I suppose, put the spotlight on this perceived double standard, I guess. Now, to be fair, it's not just Russian media drawing allusions to that. It is also other media, for example, The Independent here, saying that the US spokesperson, or the spokesperson of the State Department, John Kirby, did have some difficulty with questions from the AP correspondent about the difference between the bombings in Syria and in Yemen. Now, he pointed out that basically Saudi Arabia has launched an investigation into how the funeral hall was hit in Sana'a, whereas no such investigations have been launched by Russia or by Syria, which isn't strictly speaking true, as Russia did call for an investigation into the bombing of an aid convoy near Aleppo. So certainly what appears to be perhaps not quite equivalent standards is being pointed out by the Russian media. This is an interesting piece in the Huffington Post about Putin and why he's keeping a close eye on Yemen, and indeed the former president of Yemen, Saleh, urged Yemen's Houthi government in August to give the Russian military access to all of Yemen's bases. So Moscow's sort of support for Saleh and Yemen's Houthi government reveals, says this article, a great deal about Putin's geopolitical ambitions in the region. And this article also says that Russian state media has consistently depicted Saudi Arabia as a unilateral aggressor in this conflict, paying much less attention indeed to Riyadh's argument that Saudi airstrikes are beneficial for Yemen's long-term stability. So certainly perhaps a slightly skewed picture coming from the Russian media. Also a skewed picture, you could argue, coming from Russian media vis-a-vis the situation in Syria. This is an article by AFP picked up by Libération. And they're saying here, if you turn on radio, TV, etc., World War III is on the horizon, according to Russian state media.
It's already started, it says.
It's already started, indeed. And one presenter of the main Sunday evening primetime show on the state broadcaster said Russian anti-aircraft missiles would beat American warplanes. So this is primetime TV, state broadcaster, and we're talking about direct conflict between Russia and the US.
World War III hasn't started, but has Cold War II begun when you see the way the Russian media spins what's going on in Yemen and Syria?
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to play down this idea of a new Cold War simply because Russia is not the Soviet Union in terms of the ideology that underpinned the Soviet Union. But, you know, it does seem as though on both sides, East and West, there's a determination to go back to something like this vigorous confrontation across the board.
Right, and certainly the depiction in Russian media is that they're talking about, for example, the fact that bread might be rationed. And the government's explanation for this is that they're trying to stabilize the price of flour. But the media's interpretation of this is that we're preparing for a future war. And there are other examples as well of talk of civil defense exercises and drills. So I think in Russia, if you're listening to the media, if you're in any way exposed to the discourse in the media and politics, you're really a lot more nervous about some sort of real global conflict than you might be if you're listening to Western media.
All right, James Creedon, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.